Welcome, everybody. Pursuant to the order of reference, Monday, January the 29th, 2018, the committee is commencing consideration of Bill C-65, an act to amend the Canadian Labour Code, Harassment and Violence, the Parliamentary Employment and Staff Relations Act, and the Budget Implementation Act of 2017, number 1. Today, the committee will hear from the Minister of Employment, Workforce and Development and Labour for 1 hour and the department officials for the second hour. It's my pleasure to welcome the Honourable Patty Haiju to this committee once again. Joining you today, we have Deputy Minister for Labour Program, Laurie Sterling. Welcome to both of you. Patty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, merci. Monsieur le Président et membres.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, I am proud to be here with you today to speak about Bill C-65.
Address and ultimately eliminate harassment and violence, including sexual harassment and sexual violence in federally regulated workplaces. And Bill C-65 is a reflection of our government's commitment to gender equality. Women simply can't get ahead and have equal opportunities for men in workplaces where they experience harassment and sexual violence and where this behavior is tolerated. So this bill will provide greater protections to Canadians in federally regulated workplaces, including Parliament Hill and political staff, for the very first time in our history. Harassment and sexual violence are unfortunately not new behaviors, and while recent reports of these unacceptable behaviors have captured our attention, it's been happening for far too long, and it is definitely time to take action. Harassment and sexual violence thrive in places where we see distinct power imbalances, especially here on Parliament Hill. And it creates a culture where victims of harassment or sexual violence don't feel comfortable bringing their complaints forward. As it stands right now, victims often don't have suitable options for making their complaints heard, and they also don't have options for resolving oftentimes very serious and traumatic incidents. And I, like many of you here today, have heard heartbreaking experience from many people who feel that their complaints will never be heard, that they will not be taken seriously, or that their issue won't be resolved. So when Canadians face harassment and violence at work, whether it's bullying or threats, physical assault or mental abuse, the effects are detrimental, of course, for those employees, but they are also detrimental for employers. People who experience harassment or violence often have higher rates of absenteeism. Employers see a greater staff turnover and, of course, the loss of productivity. So ensuring Canadian workplaces are safe and healthy is really a win-win for employees and for employers alike. C'est pourquoi j'étais si fière de voir.
That's why I was so proud to see my colleagues in the House take a united stand and unanimously send Bill C-65 to this committee.
This committee agree that this is an issue that crosses party lines and that these behaviors have gone unchecked for far too long. Bill C-65 proposes amending existing provisions in the Canada Labour Code by replacing the patchwork of laws and policies that address these issues within the federal jurisdiction, putting into place one comprehensive approach that takes the full spectrum of harassment and violence into consideration. And it would expand these policies, as I said, for the first time in the history of our country, to cover parliamentary workplaces, such as the Senate and the Library of Parliament and the House of Commons, including political staff on Parliament Hill. Our framework aims to prevent incidents of harassment and violence from occurring, respond effectively to those incidents when they do occur, and support victims and survivors in the process. So I want to take a moment to outline the process for a complaint to be brought forward and dealt with in parliamentary and non-parliamentary workplaces. I want to be very clear that a complaint can be made to the Department of Labour at any time if a complainant doesn't feel that the process is being followed. First, the employer must attempt to resolve the incident when a complaint is made. Now, this can be done in various ways, including mediation if the parties agree. If the incident cannot be resolved, a competent person will investigate and complete a report with recommendations. And if there's still non-compliance, for example, the employer doesn't implement the recommendations made by the competent person, There are two processes that follow, one for non-parliamentary employers and employees and one for parliamentary employers and employees. If an employee in a non-parliamentary workplace still believes that his or her employer is non-compliant after the investigation is complete, the employee can complain to the Labour Program. And the Labour Program will initiate an investigation of whether or not the process laid out in the Code has been followed. If the Labour Program finds that the employer is contravening the Code, compliance will be sought through the use of compliance and enforcement tools that are available in the Canada Labour Code. We would first seek voluntary compliance, and then, if not successful, there are a number of tools, compliance and enforcement tools, available that include publicly naming employers who are found to be non-compliant. Similarly, if an employee in a parliamentary workplace still believes that his or her employer is non-compliant with the Code after the investigation is completed, the employee can complain to the Labour Program. And the Labour Program will initiate an investigation of whether or not the process has been followed. And then the Speaker of the House will be notified when there is an investigation. If the Labour Program finds that the employer is contravening the Code, we will first seek voluntary compliance by the employer, and if not successful, I, as the Minister, will issue a direction to the employer to comply and will notify the Speaker, and he or she may intervene. If there's still non-compliance and the direction has not been appealed, the direction, including naming the employer, will be tabled in the House of Commons. For both parliamentary and non-parliamentary employers and employees, there is an opportunity to appeal directions from the Labour Program with independent boards. Notre gouvernement a été très clair.
Our government has been clear that harassment and violence will not be tolerated. The Prime Minister has shown that he is not afraid to take action when needed.
All Canadians in February with its unanimous support of this bill at the second reading. So now the time for inaction is indeed over. Bill C-65 will ensure that workers in federally regulated sectors, including on Parliament Hill, finally have the protections that they need. And it will ensure that those who are in vulnerable positions will have a voice. Everyone deserves to work in a safe workplace, and they deserve to live free from harassment and violence. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the committee's views on how we can strengthen the legislation. Ideas were brought forward during the debate, and I look forward to discussing these with you all further. Nous savons que le problème est beaucoup.
We know that the problem is far too big for us to solve with a bill. All Canadians will have to work together to change the culture that tolerates harassment and violence in the workplace.
Legislation, we are sending a strong message to all Canadians that indeed time is up. These behaviours need to stop, and we're taking important steps to eliminate these behaviours in all federally regulated workplaces and right here on Parliament Hill. So, je tiens à remercier mes collègues.
I would like to thank my colleagues from all parties for supporting this important legislation so far.
Examining this legislation. You have an opportunity to effect real change and to send a strong message to all Canadians that harassment and sexual violence are unacceptable and will not be tolerated any longer. So I look forward to working with you all to ensure the timely passage of Bill C-65. Merci.
Thank you very much, Minister. Before we move on, I just want to take a moment to welcome a few additions to our committee, MP Trudel, MP Harder, MP De Bruzen, and MP DeMoff. Would very much like to say thank you for joining us, and looking forward to working with you all throughout this study. I believe we are going on to questions. First up for 6 minutes, MP Blaney.
Beaucoup. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, et bienvenue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome before the committee, Minister. I'd like to say that the official opposition not only supports the bill in the House, but has also come to an agreement with the other parties in committee to undertake an intense and rapid study of the bill. As you said in your remarks, this is a very important bill, and it is high time we looked at it. We'd like to send a strong signal to Canadians with the bill, and we in the opposition believe that two considerations are very important. First, we have to ensure that the process is independent. particularly for anything that might constitute harassment on Parliament Hill. This is something we're going to look at with you this afternoon, as well as during the hearings. Minister, it's very important that partisanship doesn't interfere in a process where an alleged victim could find that she's having to deal with not only someone who committed the harassment, but also the minister. So we have to be reassured on that score, and in so doing, you will also reassure Canadians. Secondly, will you show that you have the expert knowledge, the capacity within the Department of Labour to investigate and issue recommendations in cases where the process doesn't work? My first question, Minister, is this. If today somebody feels that he or she has been harassed and has some fears about dealing with her employer through a mediation process, can that person go directly to Labour Canada, and do you have the resources to take that complaint and handle it once this bill is passed? Thank you for your support of this bill.
The second part of your question, yes, we have the resources available. We're confident we will have the resources available to provide support to employers to fully implement the legislation, in particular the supports that they will need to develop the policy, to do the training and the education that will be necessary in each workplace. A big part of this is actually the prevention piece, and the prevention piece is critical. Many workplaces haven't had these conversations about what is harassment, what is violence, what steps do you take if you're not comfortable in your workplace, or God forbid you're experiencing ongoing harassment. So we will be focusing out heavily on making sure that employers have the supports to put that prevention into place. And in terms of pursuing investigations, yes, we have the finances available for that as well, and we'll be ensuring that we can do that work. In terms of the other part of your question, at any point, if a complainant feels that the process is not being followed as laid out by the policy in their workplace, that they feel that their rights are being infringed upon in determination of the policy that's in their workplace, they can come forward to the Ministry of Labour, and they can talk to the department about the fact that their process is not being followed, that they don't feel that they have a fair process, and at that point we can assist them in making sure that they receive the support that they need.
So my question to you, Minister, is how many complaints did you have in the current year, and how many do you expect once the legislation will be put in place?
Do you want to answer that?
So under the current legislation, we have very limited powers, and the only power we have really is we have no powers vis-a-vis the Hill, and vis-a-vis the private sector, it's really about checking on the policies. So we receive very few complaints. However, under the new legislation, we do anticipate a significant increase in the number of complaints. And as the Minister has already said, we've made provision for resources across the country, in fact, for there to be resources available to be able to respond in a timely way to these complaints.
Just for the financial resources, it's not in the bill, but will it be in the budget? You will come back later, Minister. Can you elaborate on the resources you will be providing?
We're confident that we have the resources in place and that we'll be able to have the resources necessary to do full justice to the legislation.
Because clearly there will be a new task to the department, so you will need to adjust to this reality.
And so we have provisions in place already to provide the training to the inspectors that will be responding to calls to the Labour Department for assistance. And we, as I said, we are confident that we have the resources.
Just one last question, Mr. Can you reassure again this afternoon that if someone doesn't want to go either to the employer, to the mediation, that they will be able to go directly to the department and they won't say go back to the employer and follow the process?
If the person feels that the process is not being followed, they will have the ability at any stage in that process to come forward to the Labour Department and say that the process that the employer has put into place through the policy that they'll be required to have is not being followed, and they don't feel that that process is being followed. The Labour Department will determine whether or not the process has been followed.
Thank you. Now over to MP Fortier for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Minister, for coming here to give us your views today and to offer the committee the time needed to give us the opportunity to take the time to carry out this exercise. One of my questions with this, are you prepared? Are you ready to receive recommendations or proposed amendments from us if they would strengthen the bill? Thank you for the question.
I am interested in hearing what the proposed amendments would be, as long as they are with the goal of strengthening the legislation. We'll be carefully reviewing all recommendations and amendments to make sure that we reach that goal of strong legislation that ensures that our workplaces are free of harassment and sexual violence. If at any point we determine that the amendment would in any way weaken the rights of people in the workplaces or weaken the regime so that people have less support, then we, of course, would not be interested in those amendments. But I've said all along that the intent of this legislation is to make our workplaces free of harassment and sexual violence. If we've missed something, we want to hear about what would make it stronger.
Puis je regarde après avoir lu.
I'm looking at the bill. We've heard colleagues from the opposition and our own colleagues talking about it in recent weeks. What impact do you think this bill will have on women, Indigenous people, on vulnerable people, members of the LGBTQ community? What impact do you think it will have on them?
It's an excellent point that you raise, that it is often the most vulnerable in our workplaces that are subject to the experience of harassment and sexual violence. And we've heard me speak about this, and many of you have spoken about this, that this is ultimately an issue of power, and that frequently people who are experiencing harassment and violence in their workplace are people that are some of the most disempowered. In our workplace, it's not hard to imagine who those folks are. There are many of the young staffers that sit around this room and, in fact, are with us today that are in situations oftentimes that are very difficult for them, and they have personally told me stories about circumstances where they've felt very vulnerable. And so this legislation will protect the most vulnerable. It is about setting up a fair playing field so that when someone experiences harassment or sexual violence in the workplace, that there is a response and that they can be confident that there will be a response. And in fact, it's also more broadly speaking, trying to lay the foundation for cultural change. I think, when you look at the work of our Prime Minister, despite many times being very politically difficult, calling out members who have violated our own party's code of conduct around behavior and harassment and sexual violence, you can see that it is not just legislation that will change a culture, it's brave leadership. It's people being willing to stand up and say, this is not okay in my workplace. As a leader, I'm going to take action and send that signal. So to your point, it is the most vulnerable in our workplaces that will benefit the most. But I would also say that employers will benefit as well. And I think, when you look at the whole range of harassment and violence, we've spent a lot of time talking about sexual harassment and sexual violence. But in fact, harassment can be bullying in the workplace. It can be, yelling at employees repetitively. It can be asking employees to perform tasks that are not part of their employment contract or their employment circumstance that puts them at harm. And I heard many of those stories as well. And so this is really about changing the culture where we learn how to treat each other with respect.
Puis, c'est probablement ma dernière.
This will probably be my last question since I'm running out of time. Could you please tell us something about the consultations you carried out in preparing for this bill? How did you look for people's views? How did you set about conducting these consultations? Our government held consultations with a variety of stakeholders and with the general public on harassment and sexual violence in the workplace.
2016 and March of 2017 through targeted teleconferences, in-person meetings, an online public consultation survey, and ministerial roundtables with stakeholders and experts. There's going to be additional consultations as we move through the regulatory development process with employer and employee organizations to make sure that we fully have a set of regulations that will work in all workplaces.
J'ai encore une minute. C'est bien.
I have 1 more minute. We were talking about receiving suggestions to strengthen the bill. You're receiving suggestions, that is. Did you hear that there was some issue regarding definitions? Will they be applied as they are in the policy? How do you see that issue of definitions? That is something we'll be looking at in the next few weeks.
The call, notably from the NDP, our colleagues across the way, about the concern that there weren't definitions. I can tell you, as I've said publicly, that the intent behind not including definitions in the legislation was to reflect that harassment can evolve over time. For example, we would not have been able to consider cyberbullying even 15 years ago, maybe. And so it was really an intent to not limit the legislation to specific forms of harassment, and when something new happened, have to open up the legislation again, but rather deal with that through the regulations. And I'll be very interested to hear suggestions about how we make those definitions within the law, if that's the desire of the committee, in a way that is comprehensive and doesn't unintentionally eliminate the possibility of future types of harassment or violence.
Thank you. MP Trudeau, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today to talk about Bill C-65. I will have a number of questions for you, but I'd like to begin by saying that Bill C-65 does have, it seems, a stringent privacy protection provisions for the victims of harassment and sexual violence. But it does mean that one might have to be dealing with third parties from the same workplace. How will you be able to protect privacy when the same people in the same workplace are going to be carrying out investigations or handling situations where there has been harassment or violence, or even sexual violence or sexual harassment? How do you intend to protect the victims? My second question, will they have any form of recourse if they have had to point the finger at someone in the workplace? If their privacy is breached, will they have any recourse for having their private information and their situations disclosed? What sort of reparation will there be if somebody who has been subject to harassment in the workplace or violence in the workplace has their privacy exposed?
You're absolutely right. Privacy is a big part of the legislation, and it's a consideration that we heard over and over. It's a factor that we heard over and over about why actually people won't come forward. Is they feel that if they come forward and people know that they've complained, that there may be cases of reprisal where an employer may punish them, or their manager may punish them, or the person who is harassing them, often someone who with more power, may in some way jeopardize their well-being, financial or otherwise. And so that's why we've tried to capture this concept of privacy in the legislation. And so that's why we've made stringent criteria that prohibits workplace committees, policy committees, and health and safety representatives from participating in investigations of cases of harassment and violence, so that we limit the information so it's not spread throughout. Oftentimes a committee may have 4, 6, 8 people. The more people that have information, the more likely there may be a leak of that information. Also, making sure that they don't have access to any information that could lead to the identification, in fact, of persons involved in incidents of harassment and violence, such as their name and age, address, or religion. Furthermore, employers and the labor program have legal obligations not to disclose that personal information. So to the second part of your question, what happens if that information is shared inappropriately? They're actually breaking the law. The Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, the Department of Employment and Social Development Act, and the Privacy Act. And so, finally, the Canada Industrial Relations Board, which is responsible for appeals, also has very strict policies on the release of private information. I suppose if the private information is released, the complaint could come forward to the Labour Board and the person could be suffer penalties under those acts. Maybe you'd like to speak about that, Laurie.
Any violation of any of the privacy requirements that will be in the new statute are the basis for a complaint to the Labour program, and of course we would investigate. But we have really tried to encourage people to come forward by providing additional protections of privacy. And I think you also asked about mediation and potential coercive aspects of mediation. And mediation is entirely voluntary. So, you know, there's no requirement to mediate. If you want to mediate, you can mediate. The choice of the mediator has to be mutually agreed on. So again, we've tried to make it, from the complainant's perspective, an option if they would like to go forward. Otherwise, they're entitled to the full process.
Merci. OK. Oh, le temps file vite. Je voulais...
How time flies. I'd like to take a few moments to go back to definitions and the need to include a definition of workplace, particularly when it comes to our parliamentary activities, because one part of the bill does concern us all here in the House of Commons, and the workplace of Parliament should be defined. I wonder how you feel about that. We're talking about education, but it is also important to have a definition of workplace when it comes to parliamentarians.
It's a challenge not just with parliamentarians, because the idea of a workplace can be quite fluid depending on the particular employer situation. And as we see with social media, oftentimes there is a leakage of private and public life and workplace and not workplace. And in fact, as an employer, I had significant challenges with that as the employer in a unionized environment, where oftentimes situations would happen in the cyber world that were between two employees that were not happening during work time. And in those instances in my workplace, they were treated as an instance of workplace, an incidence of workplace harassment, or something that had happened between colleagues. So in terms of work-related environments, that's why it's going to apply to any activity that's linked with work. Or so off-site spaces, off-site events, for example, something that happens here all the time. Not specifically attached to hours of work or places of work, but when the person, it could also be linked to online spaces, as I just mentioned. If two colleagues are engaging, if someone is engaging in harassment in an online space that isn't during work time, but it is a colleague, that could be considered workplace harassment.
Thank you very much. Thank you. MP Rumi, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Minister, for being here today. I also want to thank you in the sense that as a new member of Parliament, newly elected in 2015, I always had this vision of coming here and making a difference in our country. And when we see what's happening across our globe right now, that this piece of legislation, that in fact, as a committee, as all parliamentarians coming together to want to move this through, for me, I'm proud to be part of a government and with our colleagues to be able to start to address this issue, because as you said, it is all about a cultural mind shift. Along that lines, if when we're talking about large organizations, there's lots of layers involved, but when you have a smaller organization, such as an MP office, how does one go about triggering an investigation? Because, well, quite frankly, there's only 3 or 4 or 5 people in that office. And when you talked about the privacy part, how does that come into play?
of the legislation, employers will be responsible for having third parties designated as someone that can receive the complaint if in fact the harasser or the person perpetrating the harassment is the employer or is, a colleague in a very small office. And so every employer will be required to have a third party that they can designate as someone who can receive complaints on their behalf. And as I said earlier, at any time, if a person feels that the process that's laid out in the policy of their workplace isn't being followed, they can come to the department for assistance in making sure that the process is followed.
Thank you. How do you see changing that mindset? I mean, especially when this has been going on for generation after generation, when we look at what's happening on the Hill, quite surprised to see that we haven't really had this type of legislation, especially on the Hill. How do you see having the ability to change that mindset? What are the things that you think will bring trust back into this portion?
Well, I think the conversation that we're having right now is invaluable, and I thank all the brave women who have come forward to talk about their experiences, whether it's publicly in the media or privately to any of us that have taken this seriously. I think part of it is bringing it out from the shadows. And that's exactly what our Prime Minister has done time and again by making sure that every time that someone, contravenes a woman's right to a safe workplace, a woman's right, or a person's right to a safe workplace, that he's taken action. And so leadership is another really big part, making sure that you have a zero tolerance culture for harassment and sexual violence means that when something comes forward to you as a leader of an organization, a leader of an office, that you take it seriously and you act promptly. I can't tell you how many stories I heard of people who said, I complained, but nothing happened. I told someone that this was happening, and they told me, oh, that's okay, he's just joking around. That's a very common response that people will get. He doesn't mean anything by it. He does that to all of the women. These are very common statements that you hear on a regular basis. And when we let that behavior slide, essentially, first of all, we're telling the woman that we're invalidating her experience of being harassed. We're invalidating her request for a safer workplace. I'm 51 years old. I mean, this conversation, when I was in my 20s working in car dealerships for a while, was a regular daily occurrence. And we wouldn't even have thought to speak out about it. It was so internalized that this was part of our experience as females in a male-dominated sector that was all about drinking hard and selling cars. And in fact, times have changed. And so it's about leadership, it's about legislation, it's about all of the people who will stand up and say that's not okay. And I think finally I would say that we have an obligation to not be bystanders. When we know, we talk a lot about the Whisper Network. This has been kind of a phrase that's new to me in this work, but certainly I recognized it immediately. That's that informal network that happens in especially places like this where there's high degrees of power and low degrees of power, where people say avoid that person because that person's really dangerous, in other words. We need to take those whispers out of the shadows, and we need to hold people accountable for their behavior, and we need to do that by not being bystanders, by saying even, hey, I don't know if you know that your behavior makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes people aren't aware. It doesn't have to be at the most dramatic infraction of, violence. It can happen where sometimes people use a certain style of joking that it makes people really uncomfortable. And, if you have the power and the ability to say to your colleague, when you said that to Sally, I don't know if you noticed the way she looked, but she looked really uncomfortable. You might want to think about using that style of communicating. So it's a whole bunch of things that's going to change the culture.
Thank you. And now that this dialogue is happening and it's coming, as per you, out of the shadows, sometimes there might be a little bit of fear that it might go a little bit too much, too far. Yet you have said that once implemented, Bill C-65 will actually help empower employers to be more effective when it comes to harassment and dealing with these issues. Can you expand a little bit further on that?
Very, very briefly, please.
So do I have time, Mr. Chair, to answer that? Very short. I would just say that very clear, boundaries are never a bad thing. Having a policy in place that clearly spells out what harassment is, what sexual violence is, what acceptable behaviors are in the workplace, what to do if in fact something's happening. I think clarity is our friend. To really have a framework in place in all of our workplaces that clearly spell out what we expect in terms of the safety of our workplace for all people, I think that will go a long way to address this.
Thank you. MP de Bruzen, please, 6 minutes.
And thank you, Minister, for coming today. I was reading through the consultation report, the What We Heard report, and one thing that struck me from a lot of the reporting that we've been hearing in the past few months, but also I used to work in practice involved a lot of past historical sexual abuse claims and those types of actions, and what always came up was a lack of reporting. And the fact that it simply wasn't being reported out. And you mentioned just earlier the Whisper networks as the alternate reporting system, if I can maybe put it that way. What I was wondering is, in this legislation, and also maybe alongside this legislation, what are we going to do and what are we doing so that we can enable and empower people to actually start reporting these things right from the outset?
So again, I hate to kind of harp, first of all, on the policy, but it's because I think it's such a critical piece that there is a framework that's available for both employees and employers to know what their rights are in a workplace and what to do when something happens. Part of the challenge, if you think about this workplace, is nobody knows who to talk to. Nobody knows how to manage this. And so we talk to each other sometimes, as I don't consider myself as a vulnerable person anymore, but thinking back to being vulnerable in workplaces, we talk to each other as a form of support, but we don't know how to take action. So that's critical. But it's also important that people feel that they can come forward without a fear of reprisal, so that they know that when they come forward that their information is going to be treated confidentially, and that they're not going to run the risk of alienating themselves from their employer, up to and including possibly losing their job, which has been something, especially in precarious employment, that people worry about tremendously, not just this workplace, but other workplaces across the country. So the strong privacy protections so that information is treated confidentially, I think will help tremendously. And I think, the ability of a person to feel that if the process is not working in their workplace, if they are following the process that's in the policy and they feel that they're not actually being taken seriously or the process isn't being followed, that they do have another opportunity to go to another party, namely the Labour Department, to say, I have this workplace policy, I'm having this experience, I've asked my employer to address it, and nothing's happened. Now they have another avenue to turn, while as in the past they may not have had any support.
Thank you. And in fact, you addressed, we've been talking a lot, perhaps more about the sexual harassment type today, like when we've been talking about it. But one of the things that came up as well in the consultation, and that struck me, was part about psychological illnesses that arise from harassment and psychological harassment. And I see that it was addressed as a question about how are we going to deal with mental health issues, which are things that are also not taken as seriously perhaps in the past. How does this legislation tie into that?
Well, I think this legislation puts into a place a framework where people who are experiencing harassment and violence are going to be taken seriously and won't have to endure ongoing harassment as a condition of their workplace or a condition of their financial security or a condition of their success in the workplace. And so I think the first thing is to have that framework in place so that people have actions that they can take. I mean, look, you're absolutely right. When people are in workplaces that are where they're experiencing an ongoing harassment or abuse, it does lead to things like lost time, lack of productivity, high turnover. I used to say to my managers in the organization that I ran, if your team's turning over too quickly, we need to ask why. You need to ask yourself why you can't retain staff. Now, sometimes staff leave because they have a better opportunity or they're going back to school, or there's all kinds of great reasons and very legitimate reasons. But if there's a pattern that exists I mean, those are the kinds of things that cost employers a tremendous amount of money, and they may not even recognize what's happening. So I think in terms of mental health, in terms of psychological health, the best investment is always prevention from my perspective. You know, employers will be responsible for taking these complaints seriously, for acting on these complaints, and people who are experiencing will have avenues to seek that support.
And when we're looking at all of that, as to the key part is that in some cases, people you mentioned earlier simply do not realize that their behavior was untoward. And yet, it absolutely was. And you mentioned the role of the bystander in informing. There's an informal process where all of this starts. When you look at the legislation, it starts at an informal place. And why do you think it's important to maintain an informal process at the outset before it escalates up?
Well, in my own experience as an employer, you can often avoid much more serious, prolonged experiences of harassment and violence in the workplace if you are able to address incidents as they start to occur. And as you point out, sometimes people don't realize the effect that their words or their behavior is having on their employee or on their colleague, in particular when you have differing positions of power. I always say that we're all managers now. We were elected and we all have staff now, but not all of us have come to this place with the same set of experiences. And sometimes, it isn't an organic thing to be a good leader. You sometimes need to learn how to be a good leader. And so those informal processes allow for that process to say, did you know that your behavior is having this negative impact? And it depends, of course, on the severity of the situation. At any time, if someone feels that their safety has been jeopardized or that they need to involve the criminal justice system, they have the absolute right to do that, and we encourage people to do that. But so many times it could be a case of someone, unwanted touch on the shoulder, for example, is a common thing. He regularly massages my shoulder on the way to his cubicle. Well, maybe that person doesn't understand that touch could be threatening. It's quite possible. And sometimes if you can say to the person through an informal process, you receive the complaint, you take it up with the individual, you realize when you touch your much younger colleague, or you realize that when you touch people in that way, it may have another meaning to them, and they're not comfortable with that touch. There may be ways that you can deal with it and prevent the behavior from escalating and continuing over many years.
Thank you very much. MP Harder, please. 6 minutes.
Thank you. Minister, thank you for your time, and we certainly want to make sure that we're working together in order to ensure that we get this legislation right. So I do have a few questions just for clarification. Now, if a minister chooses not to investigate, that he or she has to give, it's my understanding that if the minister chooses not to investigate, then I believe that written reasons have to be submitted in terms of why that is not taking place. But my question is that if a decision is made not to do an investigation, can that be appealed? And if so, to whom?
Are you referring? You may be referring to the legislation, the piece of legislation that says frivolous or vexation complaints can be dismissed by the minister.
Correct.
So. There's very clear definitions for that. It may be that...
Sorry, I'm not asking for definitions. I'm asking if an employee comes forward and they want to go through an appeals process, but then the minister says no, they decide that it's not, that it's vexatious, let's say. Can that employee, do they have another mechanism by which they can appeal?
It would be very rare for the minister to get involved. These, there are numerous complaints every single day to the Ministry of Labour. We have an investigative team. I don't know what investigations happen every single day.
So
very few points is the minister asked to intervene.
Okay, so if the team says no, if they declare it vexatious, does the individual have an appeals process?
Laurie, do you want to
yeah, sorry. So maybe I could answer that question. If a complaint comes into the labor program, then we will investigate.
Full stop. every single complaint you will investigate?
The only time we would not investigate is if it was determined that it was frivolous or vexatious.
Yes, so this is my question. If you determine that, is there a mechanism by which the individual can appeal?
So when the minister makes a determination about frivolous and vexatious, which is an extremely high standard.
Is there a process by which the individual can appeal?
Yes, so you can always judicially review the decision of a minister to a court of law. So that is the nature of the appeal in the case of a ministerial decision.
The current act right now requires the minister to appoint an appeals officer. And so for occupational health and safety appeals, that is, so the decisions of this officer are binding and they cannot be appealed to a federal court. Now, I understand the Budget Implementation Act this spring will actually transfer these provisions to the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. Is this correct, is my first question. And my second to this is, will this transition be in place before the bill C-65 comes into effect?
It's true. We have moved appeals from decisions of investigators to the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. The reason for that is because they're a professional tribunal with lots of expertise. That appeal process, indeed the whole process, is set out in the new legislation and is not available at the present time.
Thank you, I'm aware of that. That's what I said. But will it be implemented? Will it be in place before 65 is implemented?
Well, it depends. It depends. Go ahead.
I think that our intention is to make it
okay,
in
so you
place
have good
before,
intentions.
Our intention is to make it in place and ready for when Bill 65 comes in force. It'll be ready. In fact, it may.
Okay. All right. Thank you. My next question then is directly for the minister, and that is, so this position a minister holds, complaints come forward or concerns come forward. Let's say an employee of the minister has a concern that the employee feels that they have been sexually assaulted or harassed in some way by the minister. Where does the staff member of the minister go with his or her concern?
If at any time the complaint is about the Minister of Labour, the Deputy Minister takes those complaints.
Full stop, always?
Right.
Okay. My next question then is, the power to appoint the investigator comes directly from the minister then, yes?
Yes. However, it's through the department. There's not an interference. There's investigators. The department has investigators. The complaint comes forward to the department. The investigation begins.
Okay. So regardless of which party is in power, we want this to be nonpartisan. Now, how are we going to make sure that that takes place? That a Liberal minister and his or her department does not show favoritism, let's say, or preference to complaints against a Liberal member, meanwhile, maybe is not so preferential or with someone on the Conservatives or the NDP or the Bloc. How do you ensure that you treat all investigations the same way, regardless of the member, the party that the member being complained against belongs to?
Very, very brief answer, please.
The process is such in the political realm that the investigators approach the Speaker of the House of Commons, and the Speaker of the House of Commons then works with the investigation.
The investigator who's put in place by the minister.
Well, there are many investigators. Maybe, Laura, you can speak about what the investigation department looks like.
Very briefly, please.
This is no different than any other occupational health and safety. The complaint comes into the program. It doesn't go to the minister. The program then assigns an investigator. We have hundreds of investigators across the country. There is no political interference in the current regime, and we will continue to operate on the same basis in terms of the investigations undertaken.
Thank you. MP Demoff for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And Minister, thank you for being here. I know bringing your experience as former Minister for the Status of Women to your role now, I know you're bringing a level of passion and expertise that all of us appreciate. So thank you for your leadership on this issue. I wanted to ask you about federal employees. We've talked a lot about people who work on the Hill. I had the privilege of visiting Edmonton Maximum Security Institute, where there have been, over a decade of harassment and abuse of employees there. And so when I was there, I made them a promise that they said that we were their only hope. And the department has done a lot of work to try and put an anonymous tip line in place, but it was a culture of where people came forward and there was retribution against them. So they were afraid to come forward. So how can we ensure that people working in corrections, working for us, the federal government, that they will be able to come forward without fear of retribution?
Well, thanks very much, and I appreciate you talking to some of those vulnerable workers. Just like any other federally regulated workplace, the corrections systems and the various institutions will be responsible for having a very clear policy on harassment and violence that will clearly outline what the first of all, the expectations of the workplace are. They will have requirements to do training for their staff on what harassment and violence is and what happens if someone experiences that. And they will have the full support of the legislation, just as anyone else, to be able to, as you mentioned, use a tip line if they're questioning, what resources they have or what recourse they have. But primarily to be able to ask for an investigation at any point, or to ask for support if they're experiencing that in their workplace. The employer will be compelled to have a process that they follow. They will also be required to have a third party that can take complaints if the person is intimidated and doesn't want to come forward to their own personal supervisor or their employer, their employer representative. That may be the person that's doing the perpetration. And finally, at any point, that person will be able to come forward, as we've said, to the Labor Department and ask for help if the process is not being followed in the way that the policy outlines it should.
Their employment would be protected throughout that.
Well, absolutely, because the process also has to be confidential. So if in fact the employer violates the confidential nature of their complaint, there would be sanctions for the employer through the department. And again, the employee would have far more tools than they would have in their current regime to be able to manage the situation and get some relief and some support to move forward.
Moving back to the Hill, what having the legislation in place is one part of it. What process will be available to members, in particular, and ministers, in terms of educating them about this legislation, to their responsibilities and also their rights as an employer, and what the process should be followed to make sure that people are following it properly, and also the employees know their rights and responsibilities?
So the department is working right now on the awareness and education components, tools, in fact, for employers that will do just that, that will assist them in developing policy once the legislation is in place, but also the training materials that they will need for themselves as managers and as employers, but also for their employees, so that they have a way to educate their staff about the policy, about their expectations as an employer, about what harassment is and isn't, and what steps that the person can take if they're experiencing that in the workplace.
Because I do think it's important that it's independent. I have 5 minutes or 6?
6. You have 1 minute 45.
Okay. In terms of the federal employees not on the Hill, it will be an independent investigation. If it's a staffer here, the process would be to go to the Chief Human Resources Officer. Is that could you just go through the process if a staff member has a problem? Because I just want to highlight the independence of the investigation.
Right. So I mean, let's use an example of an MP and their employee. And so if the employee has had an experience of harassment by a colleague, I mean, they could go forward to their employer, should they feel comfortable to do that. That would be the MP, and say this experience is happened to me. And that employer, the MP, would have a responsibility to take appropriate action to address the incident. Now, each incident is going to be different. Should the harasser be the member of Parliament, each employer, that would be each MP, would also have the responsibility of designating a third person, that if the employee isn't comfortable coming forward to the Member of Parliament, that he or she could come forward to this third party. If at any time the person feels that the process is not being followed, they can come forward to the Department of Labour for support. And again, it's very hard to give you sort of step by step because each situation is going to be different. But in a worst case scenario, the person will have the ability to come forward to the Ministry of Labour for support to ensure that the process is being followed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now over to MP Blaney.
Merci, Madame la Ministre, de votre présence.
Thank you for being here, Minister. What we'd like to avoid with this bill is a form of double victimization. Today, I can't say you've convinced me. You keep talking about being sure that they are following the process. But if somebody knocks on the door of the Department of Labour, will you turn them back to their own workplaces so that they have to deal with their attackers in their own workplaces, or will you be there for the victims so that they're not lost in some kind of bureaucratic process where they're victimized twice?
Having an ability to come forward to the Ministry of Labour at any time is not to double victimize somebody, but the intent is to make sure that if the process is not being followed in their workplace, that they have an alternative party to turn to. There'll be a support hub for victims in the Ministry of Labour that will help, well, first of all, determine the situation, determine whether the actions have indeed followed the process, and if in fact the person is needing support to ensure that the process is followed, that's when we have inspectors that will be able to move forward and support that person in that approach.
I'm not convinced, Minister, but I will share my time. Thank you.
Minister, I just want to be clear here. You stated before that it is the minister, him or herself, that will choose the investigator to oversee these complaints. Is that correct?
No, I didn't state that.
So then how is the investigator put in place?
Well, as the deputy mentioned, we have hundreds of investigators across the country. There will be a special team of trained investigators with a specialty in this area. I'm not privy to the names of the investigators. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure I've ever met an investigator in the Department of Labour because, in fact, it's very arm's length from the minister.
So who puts them in place?
Basically what happened is we have regional operations, and a complaint is likely to come in on a regional basis to the labor program in the department, and then typically the regional director will assign one from the team. And it will have, as I say, a special team, and there'll be people in each region.
Okay. So in the minister's own briefing notes here, it says that if the labor program finds that the employer is contravening the code, we will first seek voluntary compliance by the employer, and if not successful, I, as the minister, will issue a direction to the employer to comply. So it would appear to me that the minister, him or herself, whoever that individual is, can in fact step in when he or she feels that the act is not being complied with, which means that there is a bit of a trump card there for the minister to play. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned in your previous questions that technically speaking, all inspectors operate under a delegated authority of the minister. But in practice, because the delegated authority, because the statute is the minister's. But in practice, really what happens is the inspector, working with their regional director, or if necessary with an assistant deputy minister, will issue the direction. In fact, the directions they're so independent, I typically would not see a direction. until, later, and I might never see a direction. So the minister,
But the fact
minister
still
doesn't.
remains, your briefing notes say that the minister can in fact step in and force compliance. That is the minister's action to take.
The Act is under the Minister of Labour's responsibility, but as Laurie said, the authority to investigate is delegated to the inspectors.
But at the end of the day, the minister does sign off on who those inspectors are, yes?
The minister, sorry?
The minister does sign off or gives authority to who those investigators are, yes?
No.
Who signs off then?
No, the investigators are hired independently of the minister. As I said, I've never met an investigator. I've never signed a piece of paper. The department has a minister. As you know, all departments have a minister that has a piece of legislation they're responsible for. But in fact, there's very strong divides between the day-to-day operation of the department and the minister. And so, in fact, Laurie Sterling, the deputy, would be responsible for the day-to-day operations of the Department of Labour, including the hiring of investigators, including the management of her staff according to what region there are, including determining how, in fact, they would be applied to what case.
Thank you. MP Trudeau.
Merci. Je vais faire ça vite. Je vais
I'll come back to the discussion we were having earlier. The lack of definitions in C65 is significant because there's no definition of harassment or violence. All we find is in the Canadian Labour Code a definition for sexual harassment. Neither the bill nor the Canadian Labour Code nor the Labour Relations Act applying to Parliament nor the Budget Implementation Act of 2017 contain definitions. You gave a few examples, but here's my question. How can employers and unions provide training and define what harassment actually is so that things are clear? You said that a touch on the shoulder could be defined as harassment. How are these things going to be defined so that people understand what the problems are?
Very interested to hear what you or your team would consider an appropriate definition of harassment or the continuum of harassment all the way to violence. As I said earlier, this was in no way intended to limit those definitions, but rather to avoid a situation where the legislation had a definition that was too rigid and then wasn't quick enough to respond to new forms of harassment. In fact, it would have to go through an entire legislative change. So the intent was that through the regulatory process, we would develop definitions that would capture behaviors that are a part of that continuum of inappropriate workplace conduct. This could be things from teasing and bullying all the way to physical violence, and the definition would include sexual harassment and sexual violence. So it really was about trying to capture those in the regulations. Now, as I said to you and to your colleagues in the debate at second reading, I'm not opposed to having a definition in the legislation as long as it's broad enough that it would capture all forms of harassment and violence. And so if there is an amendment that comes forward with language that is broad enough to capture the full range of harassment all the way to violence, I'm not, I don't have my heels dug in on that issue. It really is about trying to make sure that the legislation is flexible to adapt should there be some new form of new way of harassing people, which, as I think cyberbullying is the example I gave earlier. That's a perfect example. It's nothing that any of us could have captured. Imagine if the legislation had been written 15 years ago and didn't include the word cyberbullying. Would that be captured by the legislation? Those are the questions. So I'll look forward to the suggestions about the definition. And as I said, if that's what makes the law stronger and there's a real strong consensus that we need that definition within the legislation, then I'm really looking forward to those suggestions.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody. Thank you, Minister, for being here today and kicking this review of this legislation off for us. We're going to suspend for a very brief 5 minutes to allow the department to come to the table. Thank you all, and we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back, everybody. We've been joined from the Department of Employment and Social Development, Brenda Baxter, Director General Workplace Directorate Labor Program. Welcome. Barbara Moran, Director General Strategic Policy Analysis and Workplace Labor Program. And from Public Service and Procurement Canada, Charles Bernard, Director General, Portfolio and Government Affairs. Welcome to all of you. You will each have 10 minutes for opening remarks, and we'll follow up, obviously, with questions. You're looking at each other like 10 minutes. Did we know we had that long? You don't need to use all your time. If you thought it was 7 minutes, if you thought it was 5, we'll go from there. You had a question, Barbara?
Sure. We actually we weren't aware that we were to make introductory remarks, so
Fair
we
enough.
are open
We can jump
to
right
take
in.
your questions if that's okay
Of
with
course.
all of you.
Yep. We can skip the opening remarks. We'll go directly to first up on your side.
Thank you.
Mr.
Merci,
Bellini.
Monsieur le Président. Oui,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the same vein as what I was asking the Minister and some questions about the mechanisms, what is the current structure you have at the Department of Labour to receive complaints on harassment and violence in the workplace? And could you please tell us about the new resources being set up? We saw that there would be a potential explosion of demands and complaints. So could you please describe what structures you have in place to receive complaints?
The first thing I will mention is that the current process right now is that sexual harassment is dealt with under a different portion of the code. So it's dealt with under Part 3 of the code, which has different provisions, different requirements than Part 2, which is occupational health and safety. It also applies to different workplaces. So on sexual harassment, for example, what the requirement is that the employer have a policy in place. So any complaints that would come forward to the labor program would be limited to, is there a policy? And that would be the extent of our ability to investigate that situation. So that's the first thing I would mention on sexual harassment. Currently, there are violence provisions under the Part 2 of Occupational Health and Safety, and there is a process currently in place whereby there are certain requirements for employers, and there is an ability for the department to go in to undertake investigations.
Okay. How many investigators do you have through the country to deal with those issues when it's policy related to harassment?
I'll turn to my colleague Brenda.
So currently, right now under Part 2 of the Canada Labour Code, Occupational Health and Safety, we have 97 health and safety officers across the country.
Okay, and they are spread throughout the country?
Yes.
Okay, so with the new law, suppose, again, I'm going to ask the same question as the minister. I am an employer. I don't want to go to my employer because he's the one who has victimized me. And I don't want to go through mediation because I've spoken to a lot of victims and they say this is just going to be going all over again and this won't solve and I don't trust. So can they go to you and will be able to go to you? And if so, are you prepared to receive their complaint?
Sure. Maybe the first thing that I will mention is that when the legislation comes into force, the labor program will have a capacity to be able to help both employers and employees through. We're going to have an outreach hub that will provide support for employees in navigating the process, so understanding what their rights are, what the responsibilities are of the employer, as well as helping them just generally navigate the process. That same outreach hub will be available for employers to be able to understand what their obligations are under the code as well. So that would be kind of the first thing that would be available to somebody that has experienced harassment. So there will be somebody in the labor program that will be able to help them navigate the process.
So you're talking of the obligation of the employee. So are you saying that if an employee goes to you and say, I was harassed in my workplace, then you will say, go back to your employer and follow the process? Is it what I've been hearing all afternoon?
So I think the first step in it is, yes, indeed, they need to make their employer aware of the incident. But that being said, if the employee doesn't feel that they're able to come to a resolution of the issue, then the employer is obligated to undertake an investigation by a competent person. So that would be a person that would have to be agreed upon by both the employer and the employee as somebody that could neutrally and competently undertake an investigation.
Okay, let's talk about this competent person. I find it's not clearly defined in the law. Can you explain me what will be a competent person and what will be the qualification and how will these people be chosen? Because, and with their decision, how will it be implemented or followed by the employer?
Sure. The qualities of a competent person are one of the areas that we're going to clearly spell out through the regulations. So the idea would be that in the regulatory process, we'll be able to consult with employers, employees, as well as other experts to make sure that we get the qualifications correct for who we would deem to be a competent person, and that will be spelled out in the regulations.
So this competent person, if I understand well, can be within the organization or without. Is that correct?
Again, it will be worked out through the regulations, but in theory, yes. Like if that's what they want to put in place. Again, I think the key part about it is that there has to be mutual agreement between the parties. So between the employer and the employee, that this indeed is a competent person. So the regulations are going to spell out what those qualifications are for a competent person, but then it has to be agreed upon.
Let me get back to this example where the employee doesn't agree with the competent person. Then can she go to the department and have this investigation conducted by the department?
So through the regulations, again, we would look at putting, I would suggest a time limit by which there needs to be agreement. You don't want to have people just continually disagree. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a time limit, and then at that point, yes, they could come to the labor program.
So if there's no, so you are telling me finally that if at the end of the day, at the end of the duration, an employee is not satisfied with the competent person or the process but that has been implemented by the employer, then they can file a complaint to the Department of Labor.
They can file a complaint at any point. It could be, for example, if your employer doesn't have a policy. If you bring a complaint forward to your employer and they don't respond, at any point in that process, they can come to the labor program with a complaint.
Of being harassed, can they?
The labor program isn't going to investigate the complaint of harassment specifically. The role will be to be able to investigate if the process has been followed. So the idea is that in the process that's set out, there would be a competent person identified by the employer and the employee that would undertake an investigation.
But again, if we don't agree on a competent person, where do we go from there?
You go to the labor program.
Thank you.
Yeah.
MP Morrissey for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to follow up on a point that was raised by Ms. Harder. And my question would be, what was the rationale for the former government on Bill C-4, and which was an omnibus piece of legislation introduced by Ms. Leach at the time, where it changed and it named the minister directly in the language in the bill to deal with frivolous complaints? What was the rationale used by the government for that change at that time?
I don't know what the rationale for the government was, but at the time, the introduction of the ability for the minister to determine that a complaint would be frivolous, vexatious, or in bad faith was associated with the changes regarding refusal to work process. So if a refusal to work was made and it was seen to be there are no merit to it, no facts against it, there would be an ability for the minister, through her delegates, to make a decision not to investigate.
So the issue of the minister being involved and named, that was brought in at that time on those changes in Bill C-4, am I correct?
So are you speaking about the change from a designation to a delegation model? Mm-hmm. Yes, that was brought in at that time.
Okay. Further to that, because it's important that in this piece of legislation, and it's important for our government to ensure that is a non-biased investigative approach. So could you elaborate on the steps taken in this piece of legislation that ensures that the minister is kept removed from those positions so there cannot even be the perception of bias, because the case was identified as, well, if the minister got a complaint from a Liberal member, we're now the government, versus somebody else. How are the public ensured that there's no biasness being shown?
Sure. So maybe I'll start and then I'll turn to my colleague to add to it. But essentially, the intention of the legislation is that there are a number of steps that need to be undertaken before it would come forward to the Labour program, potentially for a complaint. So in other words, when the employer becomes aware of an issue, then they have a duty to try to resolve it informally. If at that stage the parties to the complaint are not satisfied with that, then the employer has a duty to undertake an investigation led by a competent person, and that's where you get impartiality and bias. The Department of Labour isn't involved at that point, other than there will be some reporting, but that's it. So an investigation gets undertaken. There are recommendations made through that through that report, and then it's up to the employer to implement those recommendations. So again, the ministry is not, or the department is not involved in that. The only time that the department would get involved is if there's a complaint that the process hasn't been followed, and that's where the department would be involved.
Fine. Let me rephrase my question, because you are the same senior advisors that were advising a former minister. Am I correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
You're the same senior advisor, policy people that were advising former minister.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
So you're familiar with the situation that was identified. So given the legislation that's currently drafted, you can assure this committee that the situation was, I believe it was being attempted to alluded to by the oppositions, where the minister may be biased in the decision-making approach, would not happen within this legislation.
So the officers that are put in place are delegated by the minister. Those officers are trained to make sure that they consider facts and make impartial decisions and ensure that those decisions are put in place. So that's the approach that's taken currently with the cadre of officers with regard to all of Part 2 of the Canada Labour Code, and the extension of the provisions with regard to sexual harassment and violence would be dealt with in the same way. Our officers are extensively trained. They have to qualify and certify to be an officer, and they receive recertification on a regular basis to ensure that they understand the code and can implement the provisions of the code in an unbiased manner.
Thank you. I'm fine.
Okay. MP Trudeau.
Merci. Merci beaucoup pour votre...
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. We began discussing this with the Minister, and I'd like to continue with you. The issue of financial resources, the series of measures that have been described in the bill will engender significant budgetary impacts. So I'd like to know whether any new money will be available to help workplaces provide the training and support that will be needed to investigate allegations of sexual harassment and, of course, any other form of harassment. If that is the case, could you please tell me how much new money will be available?
Time that there are changes and updates to the legislation, resources are put in place to help employers to adjust to that. So that's in the form of education and training and that type of thing. In addition, there's an intention to put in place an outreach hub that will allow employers and employees to get support in terms of understanding the legislation and what their rights and responsibilities are under the legislation. the inspectors themselves will receive training to be able to address issues related to harassment and violence, and to ensure that they understand the legislation as well and are able to support employers in moving forward with it. There will be costs associated with implementing the legislation for employers, and I think that's where, to the extent that we're able to provide employers with this type of material to help them, that will assist them. In the long run, there should be a reduction in costs for employers, because there should be reduction in absenteeism, there should be increases in productivity, less litigation, and so on. So there's going to be some short-term costs that we will help them through, and then in the long term there should be a reduction in costs for them.
Puis concernant ma deuxième.
Regarding my second question, have you established the amount to be allocated to this? Where will the money come from?
In moving forward with the legislation, we are still developing regulations. So until all of those regulations are developed, then we won't be able to have the full gamut of all of the educational products and training and that type of thing.
Lorsque les inspecteurs vont aller sur...
When inspectors go into workplaces, will employers be responsible for covering the costs, or are inspectors hired to do the investigation and then afterwards they can establish whether there has been harassment or not?
So the employer isn't required to pay for the inspectors. That's covered by the labor program.
Employers would be required to potentially pay for a competent person if it was an outside third party, and there was a cost associated with that.
Donc, s'ils ne veulent pas payer, ils vont être obligés.
So if they don't want to pay those costs, if an inspector needs to be brought in, they'll have to pay for it. So if somebody says that they don't want an inspector in the workplace, where does the obligation lie?
So regardless, if the employer and the employee haven't reached a resolution of the issue, the employer is obligated to have a competent person, and they're obligated to pay for it. The only time that the labor program would come in is if they don't do that. So if the employer is obligated to conduct the investigation, hire a third party if that's the case to do it, then the labor program would only come and investigate if that process hasn't been followed. So those costs would be borne, the cost of this competent person would be borne by the employer.
Parfait. Puis,
I see. In collective agreements, how's that going to work? If an investigation is carried out, will the unions be involved, and will they have to work with inspectors, or will the inspector be independent of the unions?
There's collective agreements. In many cases, those collective agreements will set out a process by which they would deal with harassment and violence in the workplace. Those collective agreements will need to abide by the legislation. So in some cases, that may mean the processes will need to be adjusted in order to be consistent with the legislation. So if there is a process in place, though, through a collective agreement, then, and as long as it adheres to the requirements of the legislation, that's fine.
Thank you. Now over to MP Demoff. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here. And my first question, we had a lot of talk in the first round about delegation of authority. So can you clarify for me, a fisheries minister doesn't go out and build docks. He's delegating his authority to officials within his department to do that. So would that be similar to what the minister was talking about?
Yes, it's
okay.
so it would be delegated.
Thank you. One of the things that you mentioned was that it's the employee is required to make their employer aware of a situation, and that happens prior to it going further. Is that correct?
It's could be the employee, it could be anyone. So basically, if you were a bystander and you see a situation of harassment, you can bring that forward to the employer as well. In order to trigger the process, the employer just has to be made aware that there's an issue.
So what about a situation like was happening at Edmonton Max, where they knew that taking it to the employer was already aware of a situation and nothing would happen? So would someone still be required in a situation like that where they knew that complaints had come forward and nothing had happened? Would they still have to notify the employer before they advanced it further?
I think in the case where, how would they know that the employer is aware would be my first question. So in other words, certainly I would think that they should once again bring it to the attention of the employer.
I guess, in the report it talked about where people came forward and then there was retribution against them. So people were very hesitant to come forward because employees talk to each other, right? So employee one comes forward, it causes problems for them at work. So employee two is fearful of coming forward because they're fearful of the same situation. So if they have to continually go to the employer, do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And in that case, it was probably in employee 35 who had gone forward to the employer and nothing had happened except hell for those employees. So what's the process? If they have to go to that employer, they're not going to do it. There should be something in place, I would think, where there would be someone independent that they could refer it to if they really were fearful of retribution in their employment.
So there's maybe two things I'll mention. So first of all, under the code, there's protections against reprisal. So if there is reprisal, that is a contravention of the legislation, and they can complain about that as well. They are protected under the code for that. The second thing, though, is if the employer has been made aware of the issue of harassment and has done nothing, has not initiated the process as per the legislation, then yes, they could come to the labor program and indicate that the process has not been followed by their employer.
Okay. Does the legislation envision any reporting to Parliament? So in terms of the number of cases that are reviewed, and outcomes from it. So is there anything in the legislation for reporting?
There isn't anything in the legislation with respect to reporting to Parliament, but there would be reporting to the Labour program. Right now, employers are required to report on an annual basis issues of serious injuries and fatalities in the workplace. What the legislation envisions is expanding that so that employers would have to report to the Labour program on any incident of violence or harassment in the workplace that they would investigate, so not necessarily just when the Labour program is involved.
And is that a public report?
That's something we'll have to determine through the regulatory process.
Okay.
But currently the reporting with regard to the information the Labour program receives now on incidents of injuries and fatalities, a report is rolled up and made available on the Labour program's website.
Okay, so it might be possible to include something, obviously not personal details and confidential information, but just general statistics, right? And the review of the legislation, what's the time frame on that? So if we're putting this in place and we want to make sure it's working, is there any kind of review in to make sure that things are going well or not?
That's not something that's included in the legislation, but as part of normal practices in the department, there are evaluations and audits done on programs. So it's possible in the future that an evaluation or audit that would be done on the occupational health and safety program would include these provisions.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the employer has to hire a third party. Is that what I was hearing?
It doesn't necessarily have to be higher. So through the regulations, we're going to spell out what a competent person is. That person, I think the key part of that is it's impartial and has to be agreed to by both parties. So is it a external person? In some cases, maybe. In other cases, if you're in a large organization, say the public service.
Well, I'm actually thinking about a member of parliament and a member of parliament's. We have a member's office budget. So would that person be someone that we would have to hire? And if so, is it coming out of the office budget, or would there be a provision within the House of Commons to be able to provide for that third party?
Alors, pour cette question.
In answer to that question, it would be up to Parliament to determine the way in which it would implement the program. Parliament would decide on its own structures, and it would be up to Parliament to determine who would pay for what and at what point in the process and through what procedure.
Ben, juste là-dessus, si on peut poursuivre, avez-vous...
If we could carry on in that vein, do you have a recommendation for the committee on that? Do you have any advice? I think I would not be well placed to give you advice. There are no doubt best practices in place, and I believe that members of Parliament would well know how to define the rules and best practices to be established. Thank you. One of the questions I had, I'm trying to understand the inspectors. How many cases do they have each year, for example? How many cases does one inspector have to deal with in a given year? On average, of course.
In front of me, I'd have to get back to you.
Donc, est-ce que vous pensez qu'il va y avoir un besoin avec les études, peut-être que...
So, do you think that with the studies, we would need more inspectors once this bill is in place? Do you think that that number will have to go up?
That right now, there are provisions under the code for violence that the inspectors are already receiving complaints on and undertaking investigations. There are provisions on sexual harassment as well. They're just different, and what they're investigating is different. So there already are inspectors out in the field that are already working on these. So what we're planning to do in preparation for the legislation is that we would then make sure that these inspectors have adequate training to be able to deal with harassment specifically, understand the legislation, and are able to help both the complainants as well as the employers be able to understand what the rights and responsibilities are under the legislation and be able to undertake investigations where warranted.
OK, merci. Sur un autre ordre du dé...
Thank you. On a different subject, Vote 800 is 1800 rather is one suggestion. A 1-800 line for people to call in. How do you think that 1-800 line would work?
Details that we are still working through and getting ready for having in place for when the legislation does come into force. But the idea is we're calling it an outreach hub, and it would be a 1-800 line where employees and employers could call in. There would be specially trained individuals that would be able to first refer them to, in some cases they may need local community support. It could be that they need help immediately, and so the individual will be able to refer them there, but they would also be able to help them navigate the process. So be able to say, okay, so here are your rights and responsibilities or here are your rights under the code. Here's what your employer is required to do, and walk them through step by step. And in the same regard, that same outreach hub would be able to help an employer in terms of providing them with sample policies that they may wish to use. Again, making sure that they understand very clearly what their responsibilities are under the code.
Merci. Je suis juste curieuse de savoir, vous regardez ça de près.
Thank you. I'm curious, you've been looking at this closely for quite some time. Do you have any concerns about the implementation of the bill after its passage? Do you have any practical concerns, perhaps on the development side or just logistics?
One of the things that I'm finding, one of the big parts when we move forward with new legislation is making sure people understand that the law has changed, understand what their role and responsibilities is. On harassment and violence, there is already so much media attention around it. There's so much heightened interest in it that in one way, we don't have to be drumming up interest in it. So in that way, what I'm finding is that people are coming to us. You know, whereas we in the past we would have had to kind of proactively go out and find people, make sure that that they paid attention. We have people coming to us saying, what do we need to do? We want to make the change in our workplace. And so for me, that's very optimistic, and that will certainly help us in the implementation phase.
Puis, vous venez de mettre le doigt sur une...
You've just put your finger on one question I was going to ask. I'm the member for Ottawa-Vanier. I'm in the Ottawa bubble. Could you let me know something about what happens outside the National Capital Region, in rural areas, remote areas? Do you think that people are aware that this bill is coming to help protect them, to give them an opportunity to file a complaint if they're having problems?
Knowledge and interest with regard to the legislation once we start doing some of the consultations on regulations, something that we intend to do before the end of the fiscal year, and to really speak to stakeholders and others about their experiences so we can understand what are the specifics that need to be included in the regulations to ensure that it's actually going to function for every type of federally regulated workplace and for every size of organization.
Thank you very much. MP Harder, please.
So on this round, it's Rosemary.
Thank you for being here today. My first question for you is, what's the time frame when an investigation is launched to completed, roughly? Like if we right currently?
It all depends on the nature of the investigation and the issue that's being looked at. I can't give you a time frame for any type of investigation right now.
Okay. So leading up to my next question, I know when the minister was here, we were talking that there is going to be a significant amount of complaints anticipated that's going to be expected under this new legislation. So I guess you can't really give me an estimated time if we're going to have investigation, like if it goes so far that there needs to be investigations. Do we have any idea what kind of backlog this would cause in this system, or if the department is prepared, or what they're going to do? I know going through a complaint process and then an investigation, if that so happens, is a rigorous one to begin with, and one that would be drawn out for the victim/survivor, right?
So 2 points there. First, I would say that when we do our consultations with respect to the regulatory development, one of the things that we may be looking at is if there have to be some parameters put around the time frames of an investigation. Two, there are two parts to the investigation. There's the internal portion that was identified by my colleague where the workplace investigates. They involve a competent third person who does an investigation, produces a report, and makes recommendations for the workplace. And there is also complaints that can come to the labor program with respect to the process not working. So there's two types of work that's going on that support the well-functioning of this piece of legislation.
Perfect, thank you. I know also too at the beginning it was mentioned that there's going to be supports provided for preventing harassment in the workplace for employees and employers. Do we have any idea what that's going to look like for employers versus employees, and how employees would be made aware of what their rights are and how to bring things forward?
So I think there will be a range of educational type of material that are done. There will also be kind of awareness campaigns, that type of thing, both in terms of what is harassment, what is violence, what are your rights, what are your responsibilities. So that can take a whole range of different forms, from social media to Twitter to putting stuff on the web to we've got inspectors across the country that are going into the workplaces as well that can help with that. I think a key part of the whole process, the first part of the process, is that employers are going to be required to have a policy in place that they've developed in consultation with the workplace committee. So that is the kind of the very, very first step. If you have a really good, strong, robust policy for prevention, that's going to go a long way to avoiding complaints and frankly, to changing the culture in the workplace.
So that leads my next question, actually. So we've heard the mention of policies in the workplace. So how is that going to be monitored? Or how is that going to be regulated, so to say, right? Like, if we each have our own policy, is there going to be a specific standard? And how is that going to be relayed to us to implement?
So through the regulations, we're going to spell out what a policy needs to include. I think it's important, though, that every workplace is different. So be it a member of parliament or one of our private sector employers, they're going to be different. And so we'll have to find that balance in the regulations, that we're not so prescriptive in terms of what's required to be in the policy that they're not able to adjust them depending on the workplace circumstance. For example, a trucking company would have a different policy than a member of parliament, for example.
My last question, competent person, right, which we've been discussing, is there going to be specific qualifications for this person, or can it just be, Joe off the street, right, that we both know that's going to do this? Or do they have to have some type of education or some type of courses or training to be put in this position?
So yes, they will have some sort of qualifications. So through the regulations, we're going to spell out what we would deem to be a competent person, and that it will through our consultations on the regulations, we'll figure out what those qualifications would be they educational experience and so on.
Thank you. MP de Brusen, please.
Thank you. When we're looking at where we want to go, part of a good groundwork spot for me anyway when I'm looking at it is, where are we now with the existing situation? And I was hoping that maybe you could walk us through a little bit. Where is the legislation right now? And I was looking through an ESDC document here that talks about how there are two separate regimes. Can you walk through those regimes just quickly so that we have an idea of where the gaps are now? Like, where do we jump over from here to where we're going with the legislation?
Sure. So right now, violence and sexual harassment are dealt with separately in the code. Sexual harassment is dealt with under Part 3 of the code, which is labor standards. What's different about labor standards is that the requirements associated with what the employer is required to do are different from Part 2. The other thing is it applies to different workplaces as well. So a key difference between Part 2 of the labor program, which is where the harassment and violence provisions will be put, and Part 3 is that it doesn't. Part 3 does not apply to the public service, the federal public service. Currently, neither Part 2 nor Part 3 apply to parliamentarians. So what this legislation also proposes to do is to bring all of Part 2 occupational health and safety provisions to parliamentarians. So that's actually not limited to the harassment and violence provisions. It's the full Part 2, occupational health and safety.
Full Part 2 would be
full Part 2.
All right. So mainly it goes to breadth as far as the change that's happening as to who is covered between the two, and then as well that the two are subsumed within one piece of legislation as opposed to within two regimes.
That's correct. So what we did was we took the violence provisions that are already in Part 2 and built on them to make them more robust, and we'll be continuing to do that through the regulatory process. So for example, the requirement for an employer to identify a competent person to undertake an investigation, what the qualifications of the competent person, all of those details are, again, building on what's already there and making it more robust.
Right. A bit earlier, we had a lot of questions about what if you disagree with a decision that comes through, for example, on a frivolous or vexatious decision, or a decision that a complaint is frivolous and vexatious. What is the appeals process? Can you set that out?
So in terms of the appeals process, what happens is, again, at any point along the process, an individual can complain that the process hasn't been followed, and they can complain to the Labour program. If it comes to the Labour program and it's determined to be frivolous, vexatious, or in bad faith, and for that the bar is quite high, or if the issue has been adequately dealt with in another forum, then the Labour program can say, no, we're not going to investigate it. If that occurs, then there is an opportunity for judicial review of that decision. That's a decision of the Labour program.
Available.
Yeah.
Thanks. I was curious about data, and the data that is collected. You touched upon it a bit earlier as to what data is available to you right now. What kind of, do you have any disaggregated data about the different forms of harassment and who is impacted? It came up through the consultation that there was discussion about how it's gendered, for example. So is that data available to you?
So one of the things that we are doing through the legislation is trying to get more data, to be honest with you. It's one of the pieces will be requiring more reporting on occurrences of harassment and violence in the workplace. So that will help us in data. In terms of the data that we currently have, what we do have is certain things are reported to the Labour program in terms of incidents of violence. In addition, we do have various surveys that we look at that give us a sense of what's out there. As part of the consultations, we did an online survey, for example, that has provided us with data. We have a federal jurisdiction survey of employers that we were able to use to be able to get a sense of the issue as well. There have been more and more, there's more surveys that seem to be made public, not necessarily limited to the federal jurisdiction, but that provide us with a good sense of the extent to which harassment is a problem in Canadian workplaces.
Well, I don't have much time, so I just wanted to jump in, though. How does this legislation help you with getting better data?
So what it will do is it will, again, to be spelled out in the regulations, it's going to require reporting by employers when issues of harassment or violence are brought to their attention. So it's going to give us the data in terms of what gets brought forward to an employer.
So within the context of the regulations, then it can take into account, for example, intersectionalities and the like?
Yes.
Perfect. I think that's pretty much all my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now over to MP Harder, please.
Thank you. I'm wondering if, Ms. Moran, I'm wondering if you have ever briefed the minister on, or if anyone in the department has ever briefed the minister on an investigation with regards to an occupational health and safety matter.
I can say that I haven't. I work through policy. I'm not involved in the operations. I'm afraid I can't speak for my colleagues, so
So no one would be able to answer that question as to whether or not have any of you ever briefed the minister on anything having to do with health and safety?
I've briefed the minister on issues of health and safety, but from a broader operational policy perspective.
Okay. So would there ever be a time then where the minister would be briefed on a matter on a complaint that comes forward within C-65, within this legislation, having to do with an assault or mistreatment on the Hill?
Well, if the only moment where the minister would be brief is that if the issue is brought to the Department of Labor, and that after seeking a voluntary compliance, if that does not work, then the minister would be involved as she would issue a direction.
Okay. Okay.
So it's ramping up to that point.
Sure. So, Mr. Bernard, what happens then if the complaint comes from a staff member of the minister and compliance is not met within the minister's office? Then that would have to make its way to the minister for the minister to then make a decision as to whether or not to tell the Speaker of the House and perhaps eventually table that or that MP's name in the House of Commons, correct?
Are you talking about the Minister of Labor herself or any minister?
I am. No, I'm talking about the Minister of Labor when they have a staff member who has a concern, and that concern is brought forward and the process is followed, but then it gets to the point where then the minister now has to, in the process that's been outlined, it's up to the minister then to go to the House and to tell the Speaker that there is that process has not been followed, and the Member of Parliament, who in this case is the minister, her name can actually be tabled in the House of Commons. So I'm wondering, is there a process in place then to deal with this in a different way when that employee works for the minister?
I'll differ this one.
Sure. My understanding is that in a case, if it was the Minister of Labor herself, that she would avoid the conflict of interest by asking her deputy minister to step in that situation. So in my view, then the deputy minister would play a role in ensuring the process was followed the way that it's set out to, in order to respect parliamentary privilege and inform the Speaker appropriately.
Would it make sense to put that in the legislation then, instead of that just being your understanding?
So I think something that we have to consider is that there are other workplaces where the aggressor may be the employer. So through the regulatory process, we do have to look at putting in place a process that's going to ensure for every workplace that's under this legislation that there is a process where if the aggressor is the employer, there is some workaround put in place so that the individuals who are coming forward and speaking up do get to follow the process and there is a resolution to their issue.
I think I'm out of time, right?
About 30 seconds.
Sorry, I guess my concern is this. We have an opportunity to actually put forward some really great legislation, but this is a glaring omission to me. And I'm wondering how we protect those who work for the minister, regardless of who that minister is. Minister now, minister in 10 years, minister in 20 years, no matter the party in power, how do we make sure that the employees of the minister have a reporting mechanism in place?
I'm afraid that's time, and I do need to get to MP Trudel for the final word. You only have about 1 minute, I'm afraid, so go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I'm reading that employees of Parliament will have the right of refusal if they believe that their working conditions are hazardous at any given point. They have the right to refuse that work. Am I understanding that correctly? Pursuant to the Labour Code, they'll have the being harassed or if there is violence. So if they refuse to work, exercise that right, will they be given paid leave, for example, while the investigation is going on, or will they be relocated to a different workplace?
Code, in a refusal to work situation, it goes to whether or not there's an imminent danger. And what the code includes is a definition of what is intended by an imminent danger. And the bar is quite high. So for them for it to be a refusal to work situation, there truly has to be something that meets this bar of imminent danger.
And my understanding is when there is a refusal to work process while the investigation is being undertaken, the employee is not put on leave. The employee is that work stops until the investigation is completed.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for appearing today and answering all of our questions. I do have a little bit of future business here. February 14th, we will be going through the consideration of the draft report on our senior study. Please make sure you've had an opportunity to read the amazing changes that have been made by our analysts. The hope is that we go through not page by page, but section by section, so that we can get that process underway. And that study, that's this Wednesday, we should have the report to us soon. And that is on February the 14th, February 21st. We will be seeing witnesses again on C65 back here during the break week for 2 sessions on the 21st and again on the 22nd.
Mr. Chair, will it be possible to have the list of witnesses for next week that will be attend those 4 meetings?
As soon as we have them, we'll make sure that they get to everybody on the committee. Thank you very much, everybody. As always, thank you to the analysts, the clerk, those behind us that make us audible to those that are not bilingual, and of course all the technical people that put us on television today. Thank you very much.